If you're tired of being a third-rate duelist with a fourth-rate deck, then this is the video for you. That pharaoh taught you how to talk, I'm here to teach you how to duel. Welcome to Kaiba Talks. In this series, we'll cover the top decks of the Edison meta and how to win against them. If you couldn't tell from the deck list, we're covering frogs. Monarchs are a deck focused on tribute summoning. Each monarch has a unique effect that activates upon their successful summon. Combined with Treeborn Frog, monarchs are able to net a +1 advantage every turn. In Edison format, monarchs excel against synchro decks, OTK decks, and decks that frequently set monsters. Monarchs are an aggressive deck, and their monsters have a high attack power. However, as most monarchs' effects are mandatory, one strategy to keep in mind when playing against them is to not commit cards to the field. By doing so, it forces the monarch's effect to awkwardly resolve against itself. This playstyle is not as effective games 2 and 3 due to their sided-in cards like Vanity's Fiend. Okay, duelists, listen closely because I'm only going to say this once. In Yu-Gi-Oh! There are more games 2 and 3 than there are games 1, so it's important to know how to side. Generally, when side decking, there are 2 things to keep in mind. 1. Do not side out your engine, or else your deck won't perform as it should. 2. Do not overside deck because it will throw off the balance of your deck. In most cases, siding around 5 cards per matchup is enough. Against monarchs, consider siding out these cards. Caius. Usually decks that utilize Caius play it in triplicates. Instead of trying to out-monarch a monarch deck, it can be wise to side 1 or 2 out. Mystic Tomato. Mystic Tomato, along with any other cards that needs to be destroyed by battle to activate their effects, are not effective against monarch decks. Raikou and Hamster. Flip effect monsters or monsters that need to be set in order to activate their effects are too slow against the aggression of monarch decks. Heavy Storm and MST spell and trap removal is often not effective against monarch decks because most of their back rows are chainable. Not to mention, it's rare for a good monarch player to set a non-chainable back row, as it would lock them out of access to their Treeborn Frog. Compulsory. Monarchs want to reuse and abuse their effects, so cards that return monsters to the hand such as Compulsory only help monarch decks out in the long run. Dimensional Prison and Mirror Force. Usually a monarch player will target a monster upon its successful summon. However, when left with no choice, the monarch player will begin to target back rows. Since these battle traps are not chainable, they will leave the field without resolving their effects. A word of caution, never side out all of your deck's outs to Vanity's Fiend. Royal Oppression. This card does not stop Treeborn Frog, as it can attempt to activate its effect again in the same standby phase. Monarchs do not need to special summon in order to win. Although this card can hit Battle Fader, Junk Synchron, and Miracle Fusion, it is not worth it as the Monarch player can remove Royal Oppression at any given time they choose to. Against Monarchs, consider siding in these cards. DD Crow. It can be used to cut off one of 2 Treeborns, and in some cases Miracle Fusion, or the selected target with Junk Synchron. Fog King. This card cuts off tribute summoning, as well as enemy controller, soul exchange, and substitute. However, if can be run over by smaller monsters if it was not tribute summoned. Fossil Dyna and Vanity's Fiend. They cut off special summoning. Monarch decks only play a handful of cards that can out them. Gourds. Without the assistance of extenders such as Miracle Fusion or Synchros, Monarch decks can have trouble outing monsters with an attack of 2400 or higher. Watch out for enemy controller though. Soul Release. This card can hit both Treeborns, as well as all targets for Swamp Frog, Junk Synchron, and Miracle Fusion. Soul Taker. It outs Vanity's Fiend, breaks the dupe lock, and makes Dupe Frog miss timing. Zombie World. Stops tribute summons for all non-zombie type monsters. Bottomless. Although it doesn't negate the summon, it clears the field of the monarch. This card is better than people give it credit for. Deck Devastation Virus. One of the most powerful cards against frogs as it destroys all frogs, battle faders, junk synchrons, most of the hero package, and gives hand knowledge for 3 turns. This card is best used before Treeborn Frog hits the graveyard. Intercept. This underplayed card does not negate the effect of the monarch, however you permanently gain control of the tribute summoned monster. This card is especially effective games 2 and 3, as it can take control of Vanity's Fiend as well. Mask of Restrict. Just like Fog King, this card cuts off tribute summoning, as well as enemy controller, soul exchange, and substitute. This is generally considered to be the best floodgate against frogs. Mind Crush. Monarch hands are usually very predictable, as they often return cards to their hand with Swamp Frog. When in a pinch, activate Mind Crush and call Caius. Pulling the rug. This is the solemn warning of Edison format. It stops all relevant monarchs as well as Junk Synchron and Stratos. Skill Drain. This card negates the effects of all monsters. However, I don't recommend this card because the monarchs become powerful 2400 beat sticks.
What up, duelists? It's your boy, A True Hero. Now that Kaiba has taught you everything you need to know about monarchs, I'm here to show you an actual set. Now this is between me and Rafa23. Rafa23 was definitely one of the better duelists I've played using monarchs. So when you take a look at his opening hand, you can see there's one problem. He doesn't have access to Treeborn Frog. However, he does have Scapegoat, Double Econ, and Soul Exchange, which means he'll have no problem summoning any monarch that he draws. When you look at my hand, it's very good. So I go for the first turn Stardust play. At this point in time, I have no idea what deck my opponent's using, and Stardust is generally the better synchro to make against anonymous game states. Of course, Stardust isn't perfect because he can be outed by cards like Compulsory or Dimensional Prison. So I make Stardust, attack direct for 25, and he flips up Scapegoat. So this partially reveals what he's playing. So I have two thoughts in mind. Either one, he's playing Monarchs, or two, he's playing a deck that utilizes Destiny Hero Plasma. On my opponent's go, he goes Econ, tribute the token, and take my Stardust. And at this point, I get very worried because I have no out to a Heavy Storm. Thankfully, instead of dropping Heavy Storm, my opponent just attacks directly and attacks for a Caius. I Torrential to clear the board, and my opponent passes. I draw into a Tragodia. At this point, the Tragodia is dead, so there's merit in actually activating a Lore of Darkness. However, I recognize the game state, and that's an important part of being a duelist, is recognizing the game state. My opponent doesn't have access to Treeborn Frog, which means he cannot make any plays, which will give Tragodia time to build up as I increase my hand size with each passing turn. So I don't activate a Lore of Darkness. Not to mention, my deck plays a total of 5 different level 6s, which are triple Caius and double Malicious. I've already used both Malicious, but still, the fact to protect my life points from a devastating blow and to potentially take one of his monarchs is reason enough to keep the Tragodia in my hand. So we draw and pass for a few turns, and eventually my opponent draws a Junk Synchron, and he decides to attack with it. The reason why he does this is because it'll force me to put cards on the field, because this Junk Synchron is applying pressure to me. And if I put cards on the field, he can finally summon his monarchs without his monarchs resolving on themselves. So he attacks direct for 13, and I drop Tragodia. On my turn, I draw, and I decide to just run over his Junk Synchron with my Tragodia. After doing that, I pass, and my opponent can finally play his cards. He goes Soul Exchange into Ryza, and I flip Bottomless. This is exactly why I say Bottomless is really good against Monarchs. There are some duelists that think that Bottomless isn't very good because it doesn't negate the summon. And whereas it's true, we're pulling the rug in this specific situation is better, overall, that doesn't mean that you should side out all of your Bottomlesses for pulling the rugs in this matchup. Reason being is because games 2 and 3, Monarch players side into cards like Vanity's Fiend. And if you have a pulling the rug set when your opponent summons a Vanity's Fiend, you're going to feel some type of way. That's why I think it's important to keep Bottomless. Yes, once again, it doesn't negate the summon, but it gets rid of the problem card. So on my turn, I draw, and I finally decide to go for an offensive push. I Heavy Storm, and generally, against Monarch decks, the back rows are all chainable. Cards like Threatening Roar or Treacherous Trap Hole, they're always chainable, even Enemy Controller. However, I want to ensure 100% that this play goes through. But it's good to keep in mind that for games 2 and 3, it's best to side out your cards like Heavy Storm or MST against the Monarch matchup. So I heavy, I get rid of his Econ, I summon Diva, and I get Spine Gilman. Now at this point, I cannot make a synchro and attack because it loses to Gores. So by doing this, actually, it lessens the chance of my opponent dropping a Gores if they have one. Plus, 23 is more than 22 because Diva's 600 and Spine Gilman is 17. So I attack direct with both, but my opponent drops Battle Fader, which is fine. So I set Deck Devi and I set Mind Crush. On my opponent's turn, in the draw phase, immediately activate Deck Devi. So I'm able to finally see his hand. So in his hand, I can see he has Double Light and Darkness Dragon, Soul Exchange, and Dark Dust. So his hand is basically dead. On my turn, I allure, I banish the Caius, and I draw into Miracle Fusion, which is perfect because now I can put offensive pressure on the board and I don't have to worry about anything. Because I know for a fact that he has Soul Exchange, if he plays Soul Exchange, then I can go Mind Crush and call Dark Dust Spirit, and then his Soul Exchange is dead. So I'm not worried about him activating and resolving a Soul Exchange. So I summon Zero, and I summon Treeborn Frog, and I attack direct for 31. My opponents go, and what he does, he pulls into Ryza actually, and shuffles his hand, but he forgets to reveal because I assume he forgot that he was under Deck Devi. So he tries to play Soul Exchange immediately, which you cannot do, right? Because he skipped over his draw phase. So after he revealed that he pulled Ryza, I know his whole hand. So I just activate Mind Crush and I say, in the draw phase, Soul Exchange. And with that, he concedes because he can't do anything else. So onward to game 2. Now game 2, actually I don't open up that well. And you can see the only power card in my hand is Trap Dust Shoot. Now I've made a video, Yugi Talks Trap Dust Shoot, explaining when to side out Dust Shoot. Generally, in games when you're not going first, it's a good idea to side this card out. However, there are some matchups where Trap Dust Shoot is always good. Against decks that play cards like Gold Sarcophagus, Pot of Avarice, or monster heavy decks such as Lightsworns or Monarchs, Trap Dust Shoot is always good. So I set Trap Dust Shoot and I set Torrential and I pass. The reason why I don't go for the Mind Control play is because if my opponent has a level 1 monster set, Mind Control doesn't do anything because I can't make a 3-star synchro. And even if he has a level 2 monster set, Armory Arm is not a power play. So I set both of my back rows and I pass. So I Dust Shoot him immediately and I can see that he has a lot of spot removal. Now, generally, Light and Darkness Dragon in Edison meta is not a good card because when you think about the top decks, Black Wings and Vayu Turbo, they can abuse Light and Darkness Dragon's effect with cards like Vayu. Because when you banish Vayu, it's actually not a cost. So you can keep triggering his effect again and again until Light and Darkness Dragon has no more negates. And even against Frogs, another top deck, they have Treeborn Frog. So Treeborn Frog will continuously activate in the standby phase until it can resolve, making Light and Darkness Dragon useless. And then last example, against Lightsworn or Christiasworns, when they activate, they being the Lightsworns, activate their effects in the end phase, Light and Darkness Dragon will attempt to negate. But the Lightsworn's effect will trigger again, and this cycle will continue until Light and Darkness Dragon has no more negates. So as you can see, there are so many meta decks that can abuse Light and Darkness Dragon's effect against him. However, when you look at my hand now, if my opponent were to somehow summon a Light and Darkness Dragon, then I would lose. There's no way that I can abuse Light and Darkness Dragon's effect. So I send back Lad, and that leaves him only with a Caius. So my opponent Noblemans, and because he's playing Frogs, of course he doesn't have a Torrential in his deck. So on my turn I draw, and I think about what to do. but I just decide to pass. So we're in a draw pass game state, and I can't really do much of anything at this point, right? Now, I finally pull into a Soul Release. So Soul Release is really good. One of the better side cards against Monarchs because you can hit multiple cards, such as double Treeborn Frog. So what I decide to do is I summon Sangan and I attack. Now, the reason why I did this play, because one, if it's such a card like Dupe Frog, because we know it's not a substitute because he would have flipped it by now. But if it's a card like Dupe Frog, I'll take 1,000, which would be unfortunate, and then he'll sack for Caius. My Sangan will get banished, which will be unfortunate, but at least on my turn, I could go Mind Control Plague and make a level 8 Synchro. However, it worked out in my advantage that his set monster was a Treeborn Frog. So even though this Soul Release was like a 1-for-1, it's still worth banishing his Treeborn Frog because it cuts off access to his free +1 every turn. So I Soul Release and I banish the Treeborn Frog. My opponent pulls into a Tragodia, and on my turn, I'm able to summon Plague. The reason why this works out perfectly for me is because that puts 2 darks in the grave for my Dark Arm, and I will make Cataster. So if I make Cataster and it gets ran over by battle, that'll actually be 3 darks. So I do make Cataster and I search out Falsodina. And Falsodina here is really good because it forces my opponent to make a play if he has something. Otherwise, he'll just be locked out of the game. My opponent drops Tragodia, and on his turn, he decides to run over my Cataster, which once again works out perfectly for me because that puts the 3rd dark in my grave. Now on my turn, what I can do is actually attempt to go for game, because I can go summon Dark Arm, Brain Control, summon Falsodino, attack with everything for game. However, the only thing that would stop me, of course, would be his back rows. So this is why when I summon Dark Arm and I Prio, I decide to go after his back row instead of his monster. So he chains Book of Moon. Well, actually, he doesn't chain Book of Moon. If you read the chat, he says after the first, which is a little bit of a misplay. Because if he's going to wait until after the first, actually I have priority to activate Dark Arm's effect again and banish the other back row. However, it doesn't really make a difference because all that would mean is I banish another dark in my graveyard, which I don't want to, right? I want to keep as many darks in my grave for fuel for Dark Arm Dragon. So at this point, I'm thinking, okay, what is the best play that I can do? So what I decide to do actually is to make Brionic. And the reason why I go for a Brionic play is because if he has a card like Goriz or Battle Fader, then I can get rid of that card. Once again, he doesn't have Treeborn access, so if I can get rid of his Tragodia, he can't even summon a Monarch on his turn. So I summon Prodigy, activate Trag's effect to copy level 2, and then summon Plague, and I make Brionic. Attack direct for 23, and thankfully he doesn't have anything. Now here, what I do is a little bit of an advanced play. I actually activate Brionic's effect to return my Dark Arm. Reason being is because if my opponent has a card like Brain Control or Soul Exchange to get rid of my Brionic, then when they summon their Monarch, they have to destroy themselves. So I pass, and my opponent does go Soul Exchange, but he sets his Monarch. So I draw for turn the card that I stacked, which is Spine Gilman. And at this point, I have 2 options. I can either summon Falsodina or summon Spine Gilman. But I actually have a read that my opponent's back row is enemy controller. So I don't want my Falsodina to just die. So what I do is actually I summon Spine Gilman and I attack. And my read was correct. He did have enemy controller. So on his turn, he flips up his Caius and he runs over my Spine Gilman. And when he ends his turn, I just reveal my hand. And I show him that I have both Brain Control and Falsodina, and he just concedes because there's no way that he can out that, because that would be 36 and that would reduce his life point down to 0. So anyway, from this set, I hope that you guys can really see how to play against Monarchs. The number one takeaway I would say is don't commit cards to the field unless you absolutely have to. Because as you saw during this set, my opponent couldn't make a lot of plays because I wasn't committing cards to the field. But you also need to be wary of cards like Vanity's Theme and Thestalos, because those cards can be played even if you do not commit cards to the field. And actually that's why Monarch decks decided to play cards like the Hero Package, because the Hero Package, they don't care if you don't commit cards to the field. They can just summon Stratos at will. Same with the Junk Package as well. By having those cards, they don't care if you don't commit cards to the field, because then they can just summon Junk Synchron and begin to make synchros and apply pressure with synchros. Anyway guys, I hope this video was informative in teaching you how to play against and win against one of the top decks in Edison format, Frogs. Until next time, a true hero out. Peace.
Subscribe or you too will be sent to the Shadow Realm.